Good evening. My name is Dave Tuckman. I am the San Fernando Valley Chapter President. As President, I'd like to welcome you all to our Women's History Month event. UNA USA, we are a movement of Americans dedicated to supporting the United Nations with over 20,000 members and 200 chapters across the country. We are America's first chapter committed to global engagement, human rights, women's rights, and environmental sustainability, and supporting the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Most prominent for today, goal number 5, women's equality. I am very happy to introduce our chapter vice president, Ginny Hatfield, who will introduce our speaker. Ginny?
Thanks, David. And I want to welcome Dr. Jill Zinckgraf tonight. I know you're a very busy person, and we really appreciate your taking the time, going from one meeting to the next, and we look forward to your comments. This is a subject that's very near and dear to my heart. Jill serves as the Interim Executive Director of the National Women's History Alliance, which passionately advances women's history in education, empowerment, and equality. Her background in transformative leadership and social justice advocacy, she brings strategic vision and dedication to her role, driving initiatives that foster inclusion and celebrate the contributions of women throughout history. As a speaker for Women's History Month, Jill embodies the spirit of progress and resilience, inspiring others to recognize and honor the achievements of women past and present. And just for a little aside on the organization itself, of which she is now interim executive director, and I'm assuming they're looking for a full-time executive director. Okay.
Well, yes, at some point, yes.
At some point. The National Women's History Alliance was formerly known as the National Women's History Project, has been a leader in promoting women's history and is committed to the goals of education, empowerment, equality, and inclusion. Since 1980, the National Women's History Alliance has made groundbreaking progress in accessibility of women's history, educational materials, and advocacy. We share resources across the women's history educational community, serving as a hub or clearinghouse for our partners and friends. We are best known for its leadership in founding and annually promoting Women's History Month. And I get your newsletter every month when it comes out and have participated in many of your programs. So it's really a valuable resource for her story, right? The new definition of history, HERSTORY, which we don't have enough of. So with that, Jill, I'll let you talk to us a little bit.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me, everyone. I really appreciate this and the opportunity. Can you enable my screen sharing? If you make me co-host, that'll work. You just have to have me as host or just give me the ability to share. Perfect. Thank you. Okay, and can someone just let me know that you see just the slide, the title slide?
We see it.
Okay, great. All right, so thank you for that warm introduction. And yeah, it's been such an honor to be the interim executive director. My name is Dr. Jill Kracov Zinckgraf, and I'm so excited to be able to present a little bit about what we do and how we got here. And so every year, and also just a couple of housekeeping items, stop me at any time and ask a question. You don't have to wait till the end. I have a couple slides in here that, I'll ask for your participation, up to you. I have a couple questions for you to answer. And so we can have a little bit of fun too. And my hope is by the end of this presentation, you will have walked away with one thing that you didn't know before, and that you will be proud and honored to understand a little bit more about women's history or herstory. And so every year, the National Women's History Alliance chooses a theme. And this year, it's Women Who Advocate for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And this is the cover of our annual magazine, which you can see online, or you can purchase one and we'll send it to you. But where I thought I would do is I'll start with why women's history? You know, what's its relevance today and where did it start from? And so I have a very short video, and I should say all the videos that I'm playing tonight are short. There are trailers into a bigger video, and that was just because of, for the sake of time. And so just let me know if you cannot hear this video.
Now, kicking off Women's History Month on this March 1st, and we want to turn now to Nightline co-anchor Juju Chang, who's going to give us a little history lesson on how it all grew into the celebration we now know today.
It's March 1st, which marks the beginning of Women's History Month, a month-long celebration to honor women's often overlooked contributions to American history, like those of Elizabeth Blackwell, the first woman to officially become a doctor in the United States in 1849. Sojourner Truth, Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, all leaders in the women's suffrage movement. And Harriet Tubman, who led hundreds of enslaved people to freedom. But what's the history behind Women's History Month? It all began in 1978 with only a week-long celebration. It was organized by the Sonoma County Commission on Women. The week of March 8th was selected to correspond with International Women's Day, which had been celebrated around the world on March 8th since 1911. The movement began to gain momentum, and the following year, other communities and school districts initiated their own celebrations of Women's History Week. Then in 1980, the National Women's History Project lobbied for national recognition, and they were heard, because in February of that year, President Jimmy Carter issued the first proclamation, which declared the week of March 8th as National Women's History Week. 6 years later, the same organization petitioned for an expansion on the event, and in March of 1987, Congress passed Public Law 100-9, proclaiming March as Women's History Month. Now every March and all month long, we celebrate countless extraordinary women who've earned their place at the table. And the rest, as they say, is history.
It's history. Thank you, Judy.
And so I want to go a little deeper into Women's History Month and the National Women's History Alliance, which used to be the National Women's History Project. I'm just going to move some things around. And I've circled here Molly Murphy McGregor, who's the co-founder of the National Women's History Project. And in 1978, a student had said to her, she was a social studies teacher at the time, student had said to her, had asked a question about a woman in history, and Molly couldn't find the answer. And that single question led her down this path that has started an international movement. And so as you heard, and Jimmy Carter in 1980 signed National Women's History Week. And then 7 years later, in 1987, Congress passed Public Law 100-9, which designates March as Women's History Month. Molly Murphy McGregor just recently retired after 44 years of being the executive director. She is still incredibly active, but one person, one woman, started this entire movement. It's so amazing. I always said that when I served on the board, it was like a walking textbook for me. It was amazing, and the women are unbelievable who have served and what they have started. And so when we look at why to women's history, I have a quick question for everyone. And you can put in the chat or say it out loud, but I'd love to see your answers. I'm gonna pull up the chat. Approximately how many women are believed to have perished during the witch trials in medieval Europe? And so the years are approximately 1400 to 1775. How many women do you believe to have perished in medieval Europe through those 375-ish years?
I'll say 1,000.
1,000? It's a great number. Anyone else? 1,000. So historians,
Maureen?
I'd say maybe ballpark about 10,000.
10,000 in those 375 years.
God.
So
Oh, bad this guessing. It's hard to believe there could be more. I mean, it's just for 300 years. I'm gonna up the ante. Yeah, across Europe too. I'm gonna say about, okay, I'm gonna up the ante. I'm gonna say 25,000.
25,000, that would be a lot of women.
That's
Yeah.
astronomical when you think about it.
I just
That
see
is a
this
lot.
time span, that all across Europe. Not to mention here, the Salem
And the colonies.
witch trials. Yeah, that's what I'm gonna. Am I close?
Okay. So historians, and listen, the record keeping wasn't great. And so there's a large swing here. But what historians have called the witch trials of medieval Europe is a Holocaustal event. It is estimated anywhere from 5 million to 6 million women perished during that time. And that was for a multitude of reasons. They may have died by suicide because they knew if they stood the witch trial that they were going to be murdered anyways, or they were found guilty. And so we could do a whole semester just on what that meant to women. But in the early 1400s, a German priest wrote a book called the Malleus Maleficarum. And this was during the Christian Crusades. And it was on what to look for and how to test if a woman was a witch. Less than, I think, 1% of those that were accused of being witches were male. And so this really was what we would call a femicide happening in those 375 years. And so it leads me to talk about a little bit about why is women's history important? Because you need to know that 5 to 6 million of our sisters have perished. And that is so important. And because if we don't learn from history, right, we are destined to repeat it. And I am not suggesting that we're going to go through another Holocaustal event, but we still need to know what has happened to our sisters in medieval Europe. And so I think what's really important about women's history is that representation and visibility is so important because women historically have been marginalized and excluded from historical narratives. And this really leads to lack of representation in textbooks, media, and public discourse. We don't know what we don't know because we're not told. I also think that learning about the accomplishments and struggles of women throughout history really can be inspirational. Some of the women I'm going to talk about tonight, growing up, I didn't know about them. And I always think that had I known, maybe my life would have turned out a little differently. If I had known what was possible, not necessarily what was impossible. And throughout women's history, it really does highlight the diverse experiences of women from different backgrounds, right? We need to hear about all those voices at the table. Because at the end of the day, what we know to be true is that there are a lot of stereotypes that surround women and men, and that they're often opposite. One is better than the other. And so learning about women's history really challenges those stereotypes because it showcases diverse roles that women have been playing in shaping societies. Women's history also encourages critical thinking and challenges those limiting beliefs about women's ability and potential. We don't know what we don't know. It also gives us the opportunity to document social progress and activism. Now, I'm old enough, although I was young during the 70s. But what I can share is we're fighting the same fight as we were in the 70s. And so why? Why has that progress been slow? And so for every 2 steps, we seem to take a couple steps back. And I think it's important to understand and know that because I often talk to the younger generation and they think that what they're experiencing is new. And really what it is, it's just a continuation. I know that they talk about 3rd and 4th wave feminism, but I would easily argue there have been hundreds of waves of feminism. from very early antiquity times. And also learning about women's history really does promote, and one of the things we've talked a lot about just in culture and society today is inclusivity and diversity. And it's really important that those voices are around the table and that we understand those experiences.
Don't throw things in there.
Okay. Wait, maybe we just need someone to mute. Oh, okay, great. All right. And so let me stop there before I go on. Does anyone have any questions about why women's history is so important?
You know, I can't believe how off I was. I'm really bad at this anyhow, estimating or guessing as far as figures go. As far as committing suicide, it didn't even dawn on me that's part of the equation. It didn't even enter in my mind. That would be like an aspect of it. But oh God, that is amazing. I mean, it's astronomical. It's hard to put your head around that number. It's just unbelievable. I can't believe how off I was.
It's a big number. It's a big number. So before a few people joined us, we were talking about this, but what year did women earn the right to vote? You can put in the chat or say it out loud.
It was 1920, 21.
Almost.
1920, we got the right to vote. It was the amendment, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution.
Right. And that was, I think, was 1920, 21.
It's August 26, 1920, one of my favorite days of the year, Women's Equality Day. I celebrate it. One of the things the National Women's History Alliance is trying to do is get this to be a federal holiday.
Okay.
And so that we acknowledge and we honor the day women earned the right to vote. And how many years did it take for women to earn that right to vote? If you had to take a guess.
Well, it started, what, in 1848, I think, and then they got it in 1920, so do the math. I'm not very good.
Yeah, I'm not either as far as
Almost
almost
1870.
Yeah. But you know, it's interesting.
Yeah,
there was one holdout, and I think it's a senator or congressman from a southern state. I don't remember which one. And he almost voted against it, but apparently his mother told him to do the right thing, and he voted for the amendment. And if it wasn't for this guy's mother, this probably wouldn't have happened in
as soon as it did.
20. God knows how much longer it would have taken, but
yes.
I saw that at KCT too.
Yes.
That happened in Tennessee.
It was Tennessee. I knew it was a southern state, but I couldn't remember which one it was for the life of me. But well, at least geographically I got it right. But that was an interesting story. It really was.
Yeah, so Elizabeth Cady Stanton said the best protection a woman could have is courage. And so it did. It really started before 1848, but 1848 was the Seneca Falls Convention. Right. And that was where Elizabeth Cady Stanton issued the Declaration of Sentiments. And that really called for women's suffrage, among other things that they were demanding for women's rights. And so just a very kind of brief snapshot of what happened in those years. In 1869, Wyoming Territory granted women the right to vote and became the first territory in the United States to grant women the right to vote in all elections, including state and local, just not federal. 1872, Susan B. Anthony was arrested and charged with illegally voting in the presidential election when she walked right into the polls and placed her vote. And her arrest and trial really brought national attention to the suffrage movement. In 1890, it's when you really start seeing a shift. The National American Women's Suffrage Association formed, and this became the largest and most influential suffrage organization in the United States. In 1913 was the Women's Suffrage Parade, and this was the first large-scale parade that was held in Washington, D.C., and it was organized by Alice Paul and the National Women's Party. And the parade just coincidentally coincided with President Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. So it was really well attended, thousands of participants. In 1916, Jeanette Rankin was elected to Congress before she had the right to vote in a federal election, which is amazing to me. Interesting to note, she was outed from Congress because she refused to vote in favor of war for World War I. She was a pacifist. First and foremost, she said she was a pacifist. In 1917, a group that was dubbed the Silent Sentinels started picketing the White House. This is where they were arrested for blocking the sidewalk, picketing during time of war, and thrown into jail. 1918, Woodrow Wilson endorsed women's suffrage for the first time. And then 1920, they got the right to vote. What always makes me—
Alice Paul was out there picketing in front of the White House, and I think they were taking shifts, turns for some went out to rest, and they had others replacing them. This went on for quite a while. And then he finally, I think he went outside, or he sent an aide out. Do you need anything? I think they invited him to the White House, and they said no. He'd rather stay out here and picket.
Yes. And what makes me so sad today is that less than 40% of those females that are eligible to vote.
Yeah.
It's a very, very low number. And so women risked everything, including Inez Milholland. And what she said was, I'm prepared to sacrifice every so-called privilege in order to have a few rights. And she really sacrificed, right? If you know anything about Milholland, she passed away on a suffrage tour of anemia. She was really an incredible human being. I'm sorry?
Is she a Black lady?
No.
Yes. Okay. I'm thinking of someone else then.
I'm going to get to that. You're thinking of Ida B. Wells, but Inez Milholland rode on this big white horse. And that's where they started getting the iron-jawed angels. They were dubbed the iron-jawed angels. But Milholland was really an interesting person. She was a member of the NWHA, the Women's Trade Union League, the National Child Labor Committee, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the National Women's Party. And then because what she said was that she believed that women's votes could remove social ills like sweatshops, tenements, prostitution. The concluding words of her last suffrage speech before she passed away was, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" And so I wanted to show one of our board members, who some of you may or may not know, Martha Wheelock, is a documentarian, and she did a video. This is just the trailer about Inez, but it is so touching that I thought I would share it.
The cost of women's right to vote was paid in full by thousands of women. One woman even gave her life. Leading on her white horse, engaging audiences across the nation, and inspiring women to work for the vote. The media dubbed her the most beautiful suffragist. driven to secure liberty for all. Inez Milholland.
And so along with Inez, right, you had Ida B. Wells. And what she said was, the way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. And so Ida B. Wells was a very big proponent, obviously, of women's rights. And she fought and really highlighted the intersectionality of race and gender in her activism. She was a founding member of the NAACP. She was an educator and reformer, a journalist, and she led the anti-lynching campaign. So she was a big, big activist during this time, and really brought the plight of women of color and people of color, their experiences in the United States, to the forefront. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about Alice Paul, because she was arrested 7 times and went on a hunger strike. And at this time in the United States, if 2 doctors said that you were insane or crazy, you could be, against your will, committed into an institution or institutionalized. And the psychiatrist that was called to meet with her, they talked a lot about, because she went on this hunger strike and they were force feeding her and she wasn't going to give up. And what Alice Paul said is that courage in women is often mistaken for insanity. And this touched that doctor, and he ended up not signing the paperwork, and they released her from jail. And so Alice Paul, from the 19th Amendment on, worked tirelessly on the ERA. And so my question to all of you is, in what year was the ERA officially incorporated into the US Constitution? When did the amendment say, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex? When did that
It
happen?
hasn't officially been at this point. We are hoping it will be in our lifetimes.
I love that. Ginny, if I told you that in all the presentations I give, I never get that answer. People think
I believe
it's
it.
passed.
Yeah.
And so here's what I would tell everyone. It's never passed. And I get one of 2 responses when I talk about this to just people. People will say, well, what's the big deal? And I'll say, well, if it's not a big deal, then add it. And other people say, well, you already have all those rights. Well, if I have all those rights, then put it in. Doesn't matter. And so this has been a very interesting, we just celebrated the 100th anniversary of the presentation of the ERA.
Mhm.
So Alice Paul wrote this in 1923, everyone, and it was introduced in every session of Congress, but it made very little progress until the 70s. Because remember, Congress at this time, from 1923 to, or 1922 to 1970, was comprised almost entirely of men.
Yeah.
Only 10 women in those years served in the Senate, with no more than 2 serving at the same time. And the picture was only slightly better for the House. In 1970, we had a new class of lawmakers. We had Representatives Martha Griffiths and Shirley Chisholm, and they pressed to make the ERA a top legislative priority. And so in March 1972, the amendment passed both chambers of Congress with bipartisan support, far exceeding the 2/3 majority required. And Congress promptly sent the proposed amendment to the states for ratification with a 7-year deadline. Now that's what's interesting, is that no other ratification had a deadline. At the same time, there was a Stop ERA campaign. And the reason it was so successful is that it argued that the ERA would lead to gender-neutral bathrooms, same-sex marriages, and women in military combat, amongst other things. So the opposition campaign really caught like wildfire, and support for the ERA eroded very, very quickly, and particularly among Republicans. Though the GOP was the first party to endorse it, In 1940, the GOP lawmakers cooled to the amendment, leading to a stalemate in many of the states. By 1977, only 35 states had ratified the ERA. Though Congress voted to extend the ratification deadline by an additional 3 years, no new states signed on. And then complicating that, 5 states rescinded their vote. And so in 1982, following the expiration, most activists and lawmakers accepted the ERA's defeat. There are handfuls of us throughout the United States who continue to keep that movement alive, but it's been very, very difficult. And like I said, it's so interesting to me that here we are in the year 2024, and we're not included in the Constitution as a female. And so Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, if I could choose an amendment to the Constitution, it would be the Equal Rights Amendment. I think we've achieved that through legislation, but legislation can be repealed. It can be altered. So I would like my granddaughters, when they pick up the Constitution, to see that notion that women and men are persons of equal stature. I'd like them to see that as our basic principle of society. And so during this time in the 70s, when kind of this whole cultural revolution was happening, remember, you had the overturning of the Comstock Act, you had anti-war, you had Stonewall happening at that time. You had the women's rights movement happening, civil rights movement happening. There's a lot happening. In 1972, Time magazine published this picture. Mother Nature is a lesbian. I remember this picture.
And
Yeah,
I don't
young,
remember.
but I remember it. Wait, who else remembers it? Oh, I thought someone else said. And so I wanted to take a moment to honor and pay homage to the people who risked it all so that we could have more. And so the story of this picture is a woman in 1972 was reading about a man who was discharged from the army because he publicly came out and said he was gay. And there was a rally. And this was right after Stonewall, right? A few years after Stonewall. And the gay and lesbian movement was really gaining momentum and traction. And this woman was a teacher and risked it all, coming out and exposing herself, and then having this picture taken and then being published. And this person is the president of the board of the National Women's History Alliance. This is Martha Wheelock, whose video I showed you before. Her most proud moment of this picture is that they took that lettering that she wrote in lipstick and they made that into her own font called Protest Font. So I just thought it was just kind of like a fun thing to share with you, because as I had shared before, that being on the board has been an incredible experience, because it is all the women who have made history, but have stood right behind the scenes.
That's a great piece of info, which I didn't know, and I know Martha and just talked to her recently. So yeah,
I know that is her. That is her. And what I would tell you, Jenny, is that she's so nonchalant about it. But I can remember my cousin, who's many years older than me, who used to take me to all of the rallies, had this on a T-shirt. And so the impact of Martha was tremendous. And so the school system she worked for tried to fire her when they saw this image. And so she had to hire an attorney, and later she moved to California, and the rest is history. But amazing that she risked it all for someone she never met and for all the people she would never know.
yeah.
And so when we look at, what was going on in the 70s and what's going on today, it's the same, everyone, which is why I had said that I think women's history is so important, that we have to understand where we were to understand where we're going, because if not, we're destined to repeat it. And so we're still having conversations about the pay gap, right? And so we're at 83.7 cents to every male's dollar. And the argument has been, is that women's labor still today is really undervalued. And most of the disparity in women and men's pay, it really can't be explained by measurable differences between them. Out of the causes of the wage gap that can be measured, the main contributor is that women are more likely than men to work in low-paying jobs that offer fewer benefits, which leads to poverty, because what we know is that minimum wage is not a living wage. We also see gender-based violence. I'm saying the same numbers that we said in 1970, we're saying in 2024. 1 in 4 women, 25% of the American population, is walking around either as a battered person or is currently being battered. And 1 in 5 women will be sexually assaulted in their lifetime. Same numbers. And I didn't even put the numbers with sexual harassment because those numbers are through the roof. And we know Susan Faludi wrote a great book called Backlash in the 80s. And it looked at as women gain momentum, kind of the pushback or the backlash. And gender-based violence certainly is one of them. But if you knew that every single day, every 6 hours, we're burying a fellow sister to domestic violence, it's got to change. I would argue that that's war. We also, part of some of the conversations that we've had is leadership roles. In the United States, women make up only 27% of the Senate currently and 27.6% of the House. And according to Catalyst, women only held 7.4% of CEO positions in Fortune 500 companies in 2021. And that same year, McKinsey Women in the Workplace report found that women accounted for just 26% of executive senior level positions in S&P 500 companies, and on and on and on. And so while women represent a significant portion of undergrad and graduate students today, they are still underrepresented in senior academic positions. Only approximately 33% of full professors in degree granting post-secondary institutions in the United States are women. And so there's still an underrepresentation. But we also celebrate so many of the accomplishments of women today. And so I wanted to highlight a few for all of you, because contemporary empowerment and women that are shaping our future have really done so much. So someone like Tarana Burke, who's the founder of the Me Too movement, she has been a prominent advocate for survivors of sexual harassment and assault, particularly those of marginalized communities. And she really does create to work, she continues to work towards creating safer spaces and amplifying the voices of those who have been historically marginalized or silenced. Ava DuVernay is a filmmaker and advocate for diversity and inclusion in the entertainment industry. She founded the organization Array, which is a film distribution and advocacy collective dedicated to promoting films by women and people of color. Arlen Hamilton, she's the founder and managing partner of Backstage Capital, a venture capital firm that invests in underrepresented founders, including women and people of color and LGBTQIA+ entrepreneurs. And she's been a vocal advocate for diversity in startup ecosystems. And she works to provide opportunities for marginalized individuals in the tech industry, something that we don't see a lot of. And then, of course, Patrice Cullors, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi, who are the co-founders of Black Lives Matter movement. They continue to advocate for racial justice and empowerment in Black communities. And when you think about that, they have mobilized millions of people around the world to protest against police brutality and systematic racism, it's transformative. And of course, Stacey Abrams, right, a politician and lawyer and voting rights advocate. And we've been talking about the Fair Voting Rights Act since 1965, and we still have voter suppression. And she works in advocating fair elections, voter registration, and to reduce voter suppression efforts. And she founded Fair Fight Action, an organization dedicated to combating voter suppression. And then this other person I wanted to highlight for all of you When I think back on my life in this movement, I can't believe I didn't know this name. We have another board member, Rosita Stevens Halsey, whose aunt was the Reverend Dr. Polly Murray. Now, I had never heard of Polly Murray. This year, she was placed on the United States Quarter, which is amazing. I don't think I've ever met anyone who's been put on a quarter or related to someone on the quarter. So just a huge honor of itself. Would it surprise you to know that Reverend Dr. Polly Murray at age 16 was the first person arrested to sit in the white only section on a bus? Because I was very surprised and did not know that. And so she was a civil rights activist, a women's rights activist. She was the co-founder of the National Organization for Women in 1966. She was a legal scholar who built the arguments for Brown versus Board of Ed in 1954. She was the first Black female Episcopal priest. She was an author, a poet, a theorist. And there is a documentary on her. I'm just going to play you the trailer just to give you a snapshot of who she is.
There are some people who now argue that you cannot teach American history without teaching about Polly Murray.
Polly was a writer, a lawyer, a priest, a poet. Polly was a feisty woman.
My name is Polly Murray. My whole history has been a struggle in a society dominated by the ideas that blacks were inferior to whites and women were inferior to men.
Polly was way ahead of the times.
I chose for my senior paper, should Plessy versus Ferguson be overruled? My little argument went to the Supreme Court.
Y'all see all of the different folks that are in this room? That is made possible by Polly Murray.
If you rip away everything, oppression is the business of not respecting one's personhood. For my first 2 years, I was the only woman in the law school. They didn't even let me talk.
Thurgood Marshall is talking about Jim Crow, and she says, what I'm experiencing is Jane Crow.
Polly Murray was not just an amazing lawyer or a badass feminist, but also a queer, non-binary person. Sitting in front of Murray's notes, the turmoil and the suffering, this is a feeling I know well. Scholars who have written about Polly largely still use feminine pronouns. I don't know what pronouns Polly would say.
Trans and gender non-binary people have always been a part of our American context. So did y'all just think that your generation invented it?
But if this country is to survive, we must live together in harmony.
Polly may not have realized they would be a beacon for so many folks.
Polly's time had not come. We have to work for a world in which it does come.
You say I can't, I'll show you I can, even if I die trying.
And so as I conclude, just a couple more slides, I really feel like, March is and every month we can do this. And so we honor the women that set the path for us to follow and the foundation for us to build upon, because the other way just doesn't work. And I believe that in order to build a better future, we have to work today. And I always think that if we were able to turn the world on its axis just by 1 degree, how very different it would be. And so I want to wish everybody a very happy Women's History Month. And I'm going to end it with a video again by Martha called One Fine Day. And she wrote this and produced this in 1984. And you'll see how much has changed and how much has exactly stayed the same. And then I'll stop my screen share and we can open it if there's time for questions. It takes about 20 seconds for the music to come on.
Jill, is it mute?
Sits at her desk.
Oh.
Can you hear it?
On a cold night in New England, the candle burns low as she writes her poetry. Lives lived alone, full of ache, full of passion. Sing me a song of Emily, and my road is a little easier, 'cause she was here. I see a little clearer through the darkness called fear. Sister, take my hand, it's with you I make my stand, and we'll be all we can one fine day. Daughter of Nebraska, lover of women, painting with words the music she hears. Her letters are burning, but her life is not forgotten. Willa Cather, Red Cloud pioneer, and my road is a little easier, 'cause she was here. I see a little clearer through the darkness called fear. Sister, take my hand, it's with you I make my stand, and we'll be all we can one fine day. Preaching the word, doing time for freedom, tearing down the altars to hate and bigotry. The earth is her country, humankind her people. Emma, sing your song for me. And my road is a little easier, 'cause she was here. I see a little clearer through the darkness called fear. Sister, take my hand, it's with you I make my stand, and we'll be all we can one fine day.
so interesting to note that it ends with Ferraro running for vice president in 1984, and it took 46 years after that to elect a female into office or high office. And so that's a little bit about the National Women's History Alliance, what we do, what we share. We have a website. Please come visit us. You can always reach out to me directly. And I want to say thank you so very much from the bottom of our hearts for giving us the opportunity to be with all of you tonight.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jill. I personally learn a lot, and you, like the way that you explain the history, you could talk about intersectionality, you could talk about all those heroes in our history and many areas that I had question about. So I am personally really thankful. We have a few minutes, so I ask you the first question, and if our audience have another question, they can ask because it's important for me, and I think it's crucial to ensure that our exploration of women history is inclusive and representative of diverse experiences worldwide. I know you talked about United States women history, but how can we effectively highlight the contributions and experiences of non-Western women throughout history, and why is it important to amplify those voices in our discussion and discourse of gender equality and empowerment? For instance, the latest feminist movement of Iranian women life freedom and Kurdish women in the Middle East for Xinjiang Azadi have gained significant momentum in recent years. So could you share your insight on how these movements are shaping the discourse around women's rights and empowerment today, and what role they play in advancing gender equality on a global scale, and in United States, about our movement in United States?
Ooh, that's a great question. So thank you for asking that. Well, here's what I would say. We often talk about what happens somewhere else eventually happens here. And so there is no us and them. We are them and they are us. And so when we talk about sisterhood, it's not some people are sisters and others are them. It's we're all sisterhood. And so the movement that's happening right now, what I would also argue is that we live in a global society, and we live where we are amongst so many cultures here. And so we can't just say because it's happening there, it doesn't impact us, because it does. And so there's that old adage that an injustice against one is an injustice against all, right? I think that was Martin Luther King Jr. And I think it's really important so that those movements that are gaining momentum, they're gaining momentum, one, because they're on the right side of history and working what is just and fair and justice. And so it is so important for us to also understand, acknowledge it, and be part of it. So important. And we see this, right? And we see this in the younger generation, where they are more accepting of all. And that was part of what happened in the feminist movement of the 70s. It started to splinter because everybody's agenda was so very different. And really, at the end of the day, all of it was very important, right? It was all important. And it doesn't have to be, and this is kind of where I see this a lot, this, you're either for it or you're against it, but it can be a both and. It can be that I have my truth and your truth is also valid. And so that's the movement that we have to start shifting to, and that there's enough for both, right? We don't have to pick one.
Thank you. It's a good point of view. So I have another question, but I will wait for the rest of the people. If you have any question, please go ahead.
I was interested in what impact you think Like the Supreme Court today is hearing the case on the abortion medication and whether that should be allowed. And we had the Dobbs decision back a couple of years ago. Do you think that is enough to really incite another major women's movement to try to get, you know, our rights as they should be, since we're half the population?
That is such a big question. That is such a big question. So I have a couple of thoughts. The first is, just because you make abortion illegal doesn't mean you're going to stop abortion. You're just stopping safe abortions. And so for me, what's been very interesting watching this is that, you know, I was born of a time where it was against the law. I know many people who have had illegal abortions, tabletop abortions, back alley abortions. The teen notification bill, and Becky Bell, who passed away from doing a back alley abortion because she didn't want her parents to know. What I have found is that if it doesn't affect that person, they're not getting involved. And so we're seeing these small pockets of groundswells happening, and people are now getting involved because now it's impacting them. The removal of Alabama and IVF. And so, right, the chipping away of all of these rights. And so my hope is that I've always said that the work that I do, I always do it, of course, on behalf of all the women I love. But just as importantly, I do it on behalf of the women that I will never, ever meet, because it's that important to me. And so my hope is, Ginny, that people will start to acknowledge what is happening and start a revolution. Just feels different than it did in the 70s. Just feels different.
So how, like, based on what you talked about now, how do you see like initiatives such as our initiative focus on celebrating women achievement and advocating for gender equality, contributing to the progress toward achieving Sustainable Developmental Goal 5, number 5 of, SDG 5? And what are some practical steps individuals and organizations can take to support these goals in their communities? Because what you talked about is basically gender equality and try together against violence and stuff. So how we can contribute to that SDG 5?
I think everybody has to do is pick one topic, pick one thing that they're passionate about, and then fight for it. And I promise you, the world would change. Just one topic. And because the problem is that it impacts all of us. And so every time one of these decisions are being made, or every time a woman is harmed, gender-based violence, it impacts every one of us. And so I would say is get involved in organizations like your own.
May I have a question, Soraya?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gill. My name is Michael Moradian. But really, thank you for inspiring talk and for shedding light on the incredible contribution of women through history. As a man, and I believe that I committed most of my life to support gender equality. I'm really interested to know what advice you give to men. I think here I am, and David is there as well, who wants to be effective allies in the fight for women's rights and gender equality, especially during that Women's History Month and the way that you describe it today.
Oh, another great, loaded, awesome question. So thank you for asking that. Here's what I would say. I love that question. Here's how I'll answer it. So I have both the radical part of me and then the less radical part. And so the less radical part would say, stand up when you see an injustice. So that could be as simple as someone making an off-color remark or a comment that is inappropriate. And so silence is and has been, for me, my worst enemy. I've always had to have the fight, and sometimes it would be really nice when men are standing in the room to stand up against other men when something wrong is happening. So I think just that simple act of not tolerating goes so far, right? And because I can't police other men, and my whole life I've had to. And so it would be, and I have noticed that men don't want to ruffle other men's feathers or say something that would make them upset, but that would be the start. And then, of course, teaching our boys how to be good men and raise them to be good men.
Thank you.
That's the radical part.
Yeah, this is David. I just wanted to point out a moment ago, you mentioned about important women in our organization. I wanted to kind of share that during the official founding session of the United Nations, Lynn Harris Hicks, who was one of our longtime members of our chapter who recently had passed on, she sat on her mother's lap as a little girl when her mother was America's first female delegate to the United Nations. And since that day, her mom had inspired her to be an advocate for her entire life for women's rights and human rights. I just wanted to point out this amazing woman in my life who also inspired me, and has done so much to help not only our country, but the world in her advocacy toward the work of the UN. And then second, I wanted to point out Marsha Hunt, who was an actress who she was mentored by Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the woman who really inspired the man to create a United Nations in the first place. Now, Marsha Hunt, she learned that since World War II, it took about 10 years for America and the world to even resettle the majority of the refugees from that world conflict. So she created what's called a telethon, a call to the stars, getting all the top names from Marlon Brando and others together to raise funds to help make that possible. During the time of the Red Scare, she was a woman who was the head of the Screen Actors Guild. And at that time, McCarthy's committee in Congress went over to her and told her, here's a piece of paper, sign it. These are all communists, and you're going to verify that they are. Now, she didn't know if they were or they weren't. So she had integrity and refused to sign that paper. As a result, she got blasted in Hollywood for many years as a result, because she put her integrity first. So these are two instrumental women who are very active in world affairs and in the work of the UN as well, that I wanted to point out. And then third, I wanted to point out also Clara Barton, founder of the American Red Cross. I know that we went over all the great women in American history. We didn't kind of gloss over and didn't quite cover Clara Barton. She's actually one of my role models as a Red Cross leader myself. She's one of my inspirations. I liked how during the Civil War, Clara Barton went on the battlefield and she'd help soldiers and civilians on both sides. She was impartial, and her goal was to help and aid the wounded. Now, from her efforts came out the American Red Cross, the largest humanitarian relief organization in America, and for that matter, the largest international relief organization in the world. So it's amazing how these instrumental women have really helped make America what it is today, as well as had an impact on our world.
And what about Florence Nightingale? Even though she was British, she started her, what was the Crimea War? I'm trying to remember my history. Yeah. It was way before Clara Barton.
Yeah, she'd helped the wounded on the battlefield in that war as well.
Yeah,
in the same way.
Was it the Crimea?
I believe it was.
Yeah. So she would actually started the whole notion really of the Red Cross being in the battlefield. Can't remember, it was early 1800s, I think. Crimea.
I thought it was yeah.
I can't remember.
I think it was like in the 1870s or so. The Crimea.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for
Was
sharing that
before
with
our
me.
Civil War, I'm positive. Trying to
Yeah,
remember.
I would like to thank you all for attending.
Thanks.
Thank you, our boards, for putting together this program. I am particularly very thankful for Dr. Jill to give us a time, and we certainly put it on YouTube, send it to you. We gonna like share it to the broader community. It was a very, very good program, and I am very happy that we invited you. I appreciate Jeannie introduced you to us, and we certainly continue. And I'm glad there are good questions here. So they ask questions and the commentary as well for the respecting of time of our attendees. So and also you, because we promised you to finish the program.
Soraya, before we leave, would you please take a screenshot?
Yes, I did. I did take a screenshot. I put it on
good.
Facebook right away. I
Okay.
sent it to Instagram. So yes, I did. But wait a quick second. I'm gonna do it again. Okay.
Okay.
Perfect. Yes, I did. So I am gonna finish the recording and have a wonderful